Show. I am so excited for my guest today. We have David Player. He's going to be on to teach us what it's like to be deaf and Black in society. I'm also excited to have our interpreter, Dresden, and he's going to be helping us communicate. So, everyone, I will be pausing to, of course, let Dresden say his piece and then also allow David to say their pieces, and then we can get the show on the road.
Sounds good. This is David.
Awesome. Okay, so David, I'm going to read your introduction. David Player is a Black and deaf person who just graduated with an MA in linguistics. Congratulations from the University of New Mexico. He recently wrote a couple of articles on racism and autism on his Medium page. His research interests include sociolinguistics, language, ideologies, and policies, and critical race discourse analysis in deaf and hard of hearing communities. Since September is Deaf and Hard of Hearing Awareness Month, I wanted to bring David on. Just let us know more ways that we can be culture responsive when interacting with these communities. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So, David, is there anything that I missed with your introduction? Is there anything else that you would like to add?
So maybe a little bit on our background. Let me explain. So I started from a Shreveport, and that's in LA. So when I went over to Shreveport, it was a transfer from school, but I went to URT, graduated in 90s with a bachelor's in sociology. Graduated with a bachelor's in sociology, and so then added added on majored in anthropology. So then, but until that point, till sociology, I had also minored in Black studies. And so that was almost kind of a connector over to linguistics, where I studied in New Mexico. So it was a bunch of transferring, and then transferred later into CSUN as a lecturer. And then, it's been a long time coming. And I think my background, I think that encompasses much of my background.
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to learn from you in this episode, just with all of your academic backgrounds and interests. But my first question is, can you tell us your why? Why sociolinguistics?
Well, it all stemmed from Black ASL. I found it fascinating. And I remember looking back when I first learned about Black ASL and been exposed to it. It was a deaf doctor called Through Deaf Eyes, a deaf documentary, I'm sorry. And so Through Deaf Eyes, it was a documentary watched, and then it had like one segment about a short, quick, like 4-minute segment about a doctor by the name of McCarkdale. Let me get the spelling. McMackul. And there was a teacher now. I mean, they were a teacher at Gallaudet, but now retired. But they made a comment about Black ASL and it's separate. It being separated from deaf institutes, and so signing culture and it being mainstreamed and the differences between white and black culture, signing culture. It divided classes, divided communities, and there was a lot of people that had the perception that it was the same, and it definitely wasn't. Even within the staff, even within the classmates, signing was different, language culture was different. And so then it just kind of started a code switch, right? And so then people mentioned code switching. And so I just thought it was all fascinating. I had a chat recently with a friend of mine over in LA, and I had asked him about Black ASL. And they were like, oh, yeah. There's so many different and it's even within itself. So there's ASL, and then there's Black ASL, and then even within Black ASL, there's all these subcultures and sub niches, even with that. And so even the assumption that all Black ASL was the same was false. And so there was a film about hidden treasures of Black ASL. And so, I'm sorry, there was a book, and it was published, I think, like 2012. But it didn't hit, it wasn't, I mean, people weren't flocking to the book until the whole Black Lives Matter movement happened. And so then we saw the need and all the calls for reasoning for having more developed institutions focused on education on Black ASL and on linguistics. And so then all this material that had been laying on the shelves had become popular. And so then that led up to the publishing of 2012, that when they had the Black Treasures of ASL published, now people wanted to revisit all of these resources. But then, I mean, there was not just much attention on them until we found them necessary. And so it was interesting talking race and identity and how that connects to sign language. And so the process kind of changed a little. The process of linguistics, variations, that was just in itself fascinating. And so there started being sparks of discussions here and there. And so the University of New Mexico had a research on sign language variations that was huge. And so then it was, people were confusing that with like indigenous signs and the indigenous language there, and Mexico signs. And it was so fascinating, but it just shows the variation and dynamics in language. Now, their variation was more on a wide scale. And it was interesting to see their experiences within their lives and how it ran parallel to Black Sign Language. Because the cultures were kind of similar. There was a lot of stuff in their culture that was dismissed. A lot of stuff concerning like race and ideology. It was racism really, but it was all kind of encompassed within each other. And then it was, all falls under the classification of sociology linguistics.
That is incredibly fascinating. One question I have for you, and especially for the audience, is how would you define Black ASL?
Well, there's two avenues to it. Okay. There's the language that's been passed down. So there's during Jim Crow, there was not much language contact. There wasn't much physical contact. Because we were separated during those eras called segregation. And so because there was no physical contact, if that's the means in which we carry on language and pass down language, we were all developed in silos, so to speak. And so because contact was minimal, you had, let's say, before critical, I'm sorry. Let's say we're segregated by age, or there's also class in which we were separated, but in the classrooms we're also separated by race, of course. Meaning, over in Texas, if you're in Louisiana, Arkansas, such and such, there are commonalities between language, but they all develop differently. And because we were not granted the same access to education, language developed at a different rate, a different pace. Now, compared to those who were in mainstream education, that was like 10th through Oh, I'm sorry. This was after. This was once segregation had ended, and now they had begun mainstream. So from that point on, I do believe Louisiana was the last state to actually to desegregate, and that was much later, after the '60s. I can't remember the specificities. I don't know if it was the '60s, '70s, or '80s or not. But again, Louisiana was the last state to actually desegregate, and was the last school to set up a deaf institute. Louisiana had established a deaf institute. And I only know it as LA, so I don't know any other signs for it. But and so let me see if to test your Black deaf history. Do you know which state was the first to actually establish a deaf institute?
No.
No?
Can't lie. No. Does anyone in the audience watching, do you know what the first state is?
And to be more specific, Black Deaf Institute.
I have no. Oh, which state? Would it be Mississippi? No.
No.
Is it in the South? Yes.
Yep,
Okay.
it's South. It's in the South.
Kentucky. No.
No. Are you ready? Are you ready for the answer?
I'm ready, yes.
North Carolina. It's actually North Carolina.
North Carolina. And we do have Jermaine from Definitely Communicating in the audience. She guessed Georgia.
Georgia, LOL. No, not Georgia either.
Okay. And I said Mississippi.
It was North Carolina. And it was
North Carolina. Okay.
Yeah, North Carolina. And that was in 1869.
Wow.
1869.
Wow.
So that was 4 years after Civil War. And so it was like during the Reconstruction era and after that Reconstruction era happens when they finally set up deaf institutes. And so to me, that's like mind blowing, right? And so going back to your point, the first deaf institute was for white students only, right? And so that was 1817. So that was during slavery, right? And so that was all white and Caucasian identifying institutes only. And so those schools had opened, unfortunately, during slavery. Now, during Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, then we see how they start adding in for Black identifying and for those who were segregated.
Well, I mean, that's great that it started in the South. I think that there's some celebration to be had there.
Hey, I mean, it could be. But it needs more attention. We need more recognition.
Yes. And so that does make me want to ask, what was your upbringing like in the education in your education experiences. The reason why I ask is because a lot of us watching are in the education sector, and we work with children who are Black and deaf and hard of hearing. But I can say, I mean, first of all, a lot of us don't know how to work with Black children, let alone people who are Black and deaf and hard of hearing. And so I want to know your personal experiences with it and overall how we can be better.
Well, from my background, I grew up mainstream. That's my education experience. Um, as far as the white experience compared to Black deaf from an institute, that I mean they kind. I mean it's a struggle on their own, right? Um, I'd say, well, it's kind of here and there. I feel like there's like two. It's almost like two separate worlds. It's like white or there's Black families, correct? Um, we'll say like, okay, so out of all families, Black families, if they do have a deaf or hard of hearing child, most of them don't sign. For those who do attend an institute, most parents learn sign. I mean, it obviously is not equal when it comes to Black, deaf, and then deaf Caucasian identifying. But looking back, I think, especially for like education, um, for a deaf and hard of hearing world, some some were mainstreamed in school, which had an effect on their language. Um, and while some were academic tracking, so it just I mean I guess it would just have to depend. Some students who were Black, deaf, and hard of hearing identifying had an interpreter. Some didn't. Some who were mainstream, which are deaf students who go to school with hearing students. I did notice that the deaf and hard of hearing students, like we had not for a long time had deaf identifying professors or deaf interpreters, and I think most of the time those roles were given to hearing people, and so in what we termed as special education, it was usually placed the role was given to like an older white woman, and so an older white woman or a white man, but either a deaf or Black professor was hit or miss, and it was very sparse. There was already struggles with language, with how we navigate between in socializing, and then if there was no appropriate language in education, we go back home, and then there was a struggle if our parents didn't know sign language. And so there were some that who could write, but again, for proper like social development, there was no interaction. And then sometimes the things would go miss if the parents just spoke and didn't sign. And so there were many times where I had no idea what was going on. There were things that were overlooked on my part, and things that I just didn't catch on to. And so when I went to school, I was just trying to get in, pass my classes, and get out. And then we started learning. I mean, as we do as humans, we start to become curious of the natural world, of the world around us. And so then I wanted access to those parts of the education. And so then I do remember at one instance there was a deaf church I attended, and it was one of the first times I was exposed to like complete and total sign language, where the deaf goers, there were deaf goers, the preacher role was a signer. And so then even within sign language, there's differences between ASL, which is the conceptual sign, and then signed exact English. And so I didn't really have much exposure to that until I got connected to other students who were in the educational field, whether it was in or out of school. And so for my receptive skills, I mean, I sign more so sign English, but it's a whole different gambit when we're talking about receptive. And so for the Black and Deaf community, the pastor, of course, was white. I mean, I never had a Black pastor before, that new sign, but it was interesting to see because I didn't know what I could, what was possible until I become exposed to it. But it was interesting to see the two worlds operate. So a Black church, so let's think Black church, but no language access. There's no interpreter. And so then, I'm like, well, where's my access? It's over here where there's it may not be my world, right? It may not be my skin tone, but there's language access. And so we flock to where we have access to the language. And so now, as I'm, growing up, I see I'm meeting families that don't sign in academic settings that aren't conducive to the student, or I'll go to, there's churches who sign, and then we're seeing the gambit of these different arenas where there's language access, but there's no accommodation to my skin tone and all that. And so the decisions are different. And I have to say, compared to the Institute, because most of what I know, or from what I know, most Black deaf go to a mainstream school. Meaning, I mean, that's just my experience. And I guess it would also depend on what state you're in. Texas is huge, right? Much bigger state. And so we have a lot of deaf who are found in the Texas area. But surrounding areas other than Texas, I'm not too sure. And so I can say LA definitely have a high degree of mainstream students, but I'm not too sure. I guess it would honestly depend on your geographical region, but the impact of language varies. And I will say the impact varies depending on a lot of Black deaf tend to sign more signed exact English. But if you did attend Gallaudet University, which is a Black Deaf Institute, I'm sorry, not Black Deaf, it's Deaf Institute. There's also RIT, Rochester. And I think that's the National Institute of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And I think that's more of I'd say it's more of a community college that's ran under RIT. And so there's a technical college that we could attend to get a degree, or if you want to just do like a bachelor's, or it just depends. We have options, but Gallaudet is a 4-year plus university. So often we'll see Black deaf students attend there, going to Gallaudet University, and then there's discrimination with sign language mode, like, oh, you signed exact English, and it's almost looked down upon. And so think classism, but for language. And so because I didn't grow up in an institute where language or education was provided in my first language and sign, it was almost a class system. And so it's kind of hit or miss. Depending on where you grow up will define if you sign exact English or ASL. For those in an institute, of course, it's ASL, but it's less contact with older deaf who maybe were alumni or post-immigration or integration. Which means, I mean, the older generation had the education and background, and if we had no contact with them, how are things getting passed down, right? So it's almost at some points language was stunted. And so then there was no pass down of like ASL. There was, I mean, if we needed access to the language, we wherever it was given to us, or wherever we could find it, is where we, would flock to. And so we saw how deaf culture, or how culture period impact language. And so we learned that not everything was the same. And so if we think about, for example, words like "what's up," we sign "what's up," right? So like, hey, what's up? Hey, that. And so um, we had a black hearing person who, they were oral, and so they took the English sign and saw how hearing culture picking, and how they wear the language will influence the deaf culture. Or words like how the hearing world will say, I feel you, I got you, that. And so we see the influence in how that language, for anyone who wears sign language, can influence the culture of the deaf and hard of hearing. And so it's almost like they're separate worlds, but at some point the language overlaps depending on who's wearing it. And so language, and I mean that's how the etymology of language happens, right? And so it's really hard for me to like encapsulate what it is to be and wear black ASL. Yeah, it's just hard.
Well, I mean, David, there's so much we can learn from you, but I would keep you here for like 5 days. So I'm gonna try to keep my questions as short as possible. Um, Two really pressing questions. I have really three. The first one is I know that you have a medium. You have your website and you have your blog. Can you actually explain that?
Okay, so my first blog or WordPress, that happened just out of the blue. And so my goal was I was targeting the Black deaf community. And so really, I was getting like not good feedback from any of the worlds I was hitting. Oh, so it all kind of stemmed from the George Floyd incident. And so when that happened, I mean, and understandably, this is when I was a student, and so I didn't know about much of I wasn't given exposure or any of research into what a blog was or whatnot, and so I kind of just like had something to say, and so I thought, hey, let me just go with WordPress, and so it kind of happened out of the blue, and so they were someone had mentioned something about white privilege, and so when the George Floyd incident happened, we had noticed Black people were all in an uproar, right? And so there was all this panic around us and in society at large. And so because I had noticed what was going on around me, at deaf, they were acting like, it didn't affect them. So I was like, that's one situation that's that could impact and connect to the deaf and hard of hearing community. And so so we saw ourselves as separate worlds, but honestly, we're all one entity. And so there was no real trajectory when I set up the blog. It just kind of happened because of circumstances and situations that were happening in society. Elitism. Okay, so as for the word elitism, I actually learned from a few of my Black deaf identifying friends in the deaf and hard of hearing world. And so when I first mentioned it, I mean, I heard it here and there, um, but there was not much that I heard in the deaf community. So I had to kind of jump to the hearing world. Um, and so as far as elitism, it focused more on I saw the focus more on the deaf and hard of hearing world. And so it's almost like when they decided to I'm sorry, elitism and racism kind of go hand in hand. And so every time I did hear the word elitism, it was always discussed in a more broad sense. And so in mainstream, we saw it identified as like discrimination. So when I first wrote the word, it's when I first heard the word, it was brought up during a study in autism. And so then I was like, what's this? And of course, it's easier to discuss racism than it is elitism. And so that was just my experience of it. And so that's how I saw it connect to my identity. And grant, I mean, mind you, I did experience both in and out of being mainstream. And so it's really hard to like pinpoint racism. I can't really like talk racism without bringing up all these other sectors in which they connect, right? So that was just my idea on it.
Could you give us just a quick understanding of autism?
Yeah, so autism really came up from Tom Humphrey. It was a word. It was a white deaf man who coined the term. And so I believe that was like 1975. I'm not too sure when the word had been coined, but the word had become very popular in the later years following. And so they had a documentary called Autism Unveiled. And so Autism Unveiled. And so it almost showed, it was a Vimeo clip. And I remember watching it a few years back. And it made a lot of sense to me. I remember, I mean, same as Dr. McCockle.
Castle?
No, MC McKill? MCMACKILL. MCCAS the castle. And so it was the same woman from the Through Deaf Eye, same producer. And so they were featured, and it was just a short clip that said, one, Black racism, a woman identifying deaf, and so then that was when she mentioned autism. And so I thought the concept of it was a bit easier, but the point was, it's to say that if you have no access to hearing, then you're looked down upon. So it's to say, if you had no audible stimulus, and if you were limited, then you as a person was limited. And so you're kind of looked down upon as less than. And so less than, discriminated, whether it be in work, in family, or the world at large, whatever society deemed as such. So related to the Black community, autism related to the Black community meant things like we'd be teased on language we chose, linguism. And so linguism and autism is kind of the same thing, but within the deaf and hard of hearing, it depends. It kind of relates to what our our mode of language was. And so, because our mode of language also depended on what kind of support we had around us, it was almost as though we were being made fun of a lack of resources or support. Um, that was more like of a spoken thing. Because let's say if I ask, oh, are you Black deaf identifying? And there's a slew of there are deaf who sign, deaf who are oral, and then those who run the gambit in between, depending on their background and upbringing. So if I ask, if I saw like Black deaf person, and they grew up oral, compared to a Black deaf person who grew up in sign, who's going to navigate? Which one do you feel you're going to connect to more, right? Who do we lean into? And so, but get this, they're both Black, they're both deaf. One is oral, which means their mode of language they choose is to speak, and then the other mode of language they choose to sign. And so, who do you think, asking you personally, who would you naturally be drawn to? The person that speaks, right? Because it's easier to navigate the space. And so then autism was, because you can't speak, I mean, it's almost like you're limited. And so our first jump to wouldn't be the person where their language or whatever access to language they had or chose was not the equivalent person. And so when it becomes deaf deaf looking at deaf, it's a little different. And so with how we navigate society, yes, autism happens, but it's almost like there's no Black deaf-led organizations. There's not much access. And so there's habits where racism or racism-like structures develop. And I'm curious to know, and then this is me asking you directly, do you know the NAACP? You're familiar with NAACP, correct?
Yes.
Curious, do you know NBDA? Do you know the organization NBDA?
I want to say I've heard of it.
So it's the National Black Deaf Advocates.
Okay. Thank
Have you familiar with them?
No. No.
Right. And so the conference actually just happened about 2 weeks ago. But where in the Black community would that have been spotlighted or highlighted? Where? I mean, where do we see that?
It'd be great if it were social media, at least.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I mean, it's on my social media, but out of just me, I mean, where else would we have seen it? I mean, and it's a national level organization. It's pretty renowned. It's popular, but where do we see access to it? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do have one last question for you, and first of all, it's called NDBA. Yes, Joanna says, "Where's the spotlight?" Yeah, because when you mentioned it, I have not seen anything about it, but I understand our social media communities are different, so that's also on me um, to continue reaching out to people who are part of the community. The National Black Deaf Advocate. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Yeah, of course, no problem, no problem. And the conference really is every 2 years, and so the next one I think is 2025. And so might have to double check that, I think, but yeah.
Yes, no, well, now I'll be on the
Yeah,
lookout. Now,
yeah,
now
definitely gonna share more.
yes, yes. No, now I have my eyes on it. Well, I do have one final question for you, David. When we talk about the medical system, and Jermaine, I know I keep friggin' pulling you into this conversation, but Jermaine is a speech pathologist who talks a lot about the social determinants of health versus the medical model. Yes, and so I want to know if you could just give us a little background about your experience in the healthcare system, any challenges you've faced, and how you've overcome them.
Okay, wait. Over. Okay, so so general medical health care, communication access happens where? I think nowadays hospitals will use more of a VRI setup. Well, video remote or video relay interpreter, and so it's almost like a digital computer screen that they'll come and bring over, and on the screen is a interpreter that can see what's happening around in the medical room, and then we have access to the screen where the interpreter is interpreting. But sometimes we have like a representation problem there, because how many Black interpreters do you know in the healthcare field? And I don't think there's much. I will say professional interpreters, it's almost 90% total white female. So in the profession, and so then that's a substantially high number. And so last time I think it was a few years back, about probably like 40% or so ish, 45, is now lower. Meaning, if I go to anything medical, if I go to a doctor for a doctor visit, and then the chances of it being me being placed with a Black interpreter are not high. And that's just the culture. That's just the culture representation part. And so it will depend on, most of the time it's a white interpreter. So that's my experiences of it. If if they'll always bill and book the interpreter who knows or have access knowledge to ins and out of the medical system. And so where there has been habit of, oh, we're going to place this person because they have the knowledge and resources to get in and out and do the job, it's going to always be that person. And so now we see issues with there being the proper relay of communication. Well, if this language does not fit who I am and who I identify with, then that's an incident where a hiccup could occur. And so we need to raise the bar and access to Black interpreters. For hospitals, they have more of sometimes they have their like own in-staff interpreters or something, maybe where it's easier to or it's easier to call an interpreter rather than instead of having a third-party agency where they have to now call and set up appointments and then have the interpreter come in and for that whatever time the appointment is. And then some interpreters don't follow confidentiality policies. So then where they have access to sensitive information, some of them choose right after the job to spread the good news. And so it really just depends on the educational level too. If you have the education and access to the language, then that's going to be the person they staff. Sometimes there are incidences where the job isn't too extraneous, where we need an interpreter. Like if it's, hey, come in, take a pill, it's something simple, then that doesn't require the language.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, David. I lied. I actually have two more final questions. One of them is really if you can just share a vision with us of a future where intersectionality is fully integrated in healthcare and education. What would that look like for you?
Okay, so I'll say, let me speak on education, because education I can speak more so on, since I'm more familiar with that background. If you look at education, we'll have, so let's say a deaf studies program. So I'm sorry, a deaf studies program and a black studies program. Well, obviously I'm both, right? I'm both, but at some point it becomes a issue where I don't see myself in neither programs. So with black studies, I'm obviously black, but where's the black deaf? I mean, I see it in deaf studies, but where's the black? you know? And
Yeah.
so, I mean, there's a famous book. It's called Bet. Here, let me show you the book real quick.
Please. Thank you. A little bit down on the title. Songs Like Home.
Yep.
Like Home.
And so it talks about what's it like growing up black and deaf in the South. And Mary Wright is the writer, and herself actually identifies black and deaf. And she published the book, I think this was back in about 20 years ago or so. But it's just explaining her experiences living during segregation in North Carolina at an institute. And so it's interesting. I mean, when I was reading the notes and the comments and experiences, black deaf from looking at black studies compared to deaf studies. And so a lot of the black studies will only focus on black hearing, so black theory, sociology, all of that encompass what it meant to be black but not deaf. And so then last is this.
Still I Rise. Yeah.
And so this is about a black deaf in Arkansas. And so they tend to do a lot of mainstreaming, and this was done like early 2000s, I believe. And all of this encompassed black, nothing that has anything to do with black studies. But I was curious enough and had a discussion. So black studies, I've seen usually focus on like classism, and a slew of different systems, colorism, but none of which I've seen notice anything on disabilities. There's a lack of mention on disabilities. And so was it overlooked? Was it oversight? And so in deaf studies, we now see, once I finally took a look into it, I saw someone finally mention disabilities, but it was only in deaf literature, right? And so it's so hard to find even where these worlds will clash, where they meet, and where we'll find intersectionality and all these specialists all encompassed in one system. But maybe we just have to make it known. I don't know. Oh, and this is also one more that I want to mention.
The Segregated Georgia School for the Deaf. Okay.
Yeah, and so with this one, most of the information both authors found through deaf literature, and it was called, and it was an older name. It was SIL section print. Oh, Silent Press. I'm sorry, Silent Press. And so that was a much older agency. And so that's when they were like in communication with their parents, and then their parents helped them write the book and then published it. But it was, I mean, all the information was mentioned about segregation, deaf institutes, what kind of education modes they were in, their roles as students, and a whole slew of things. But it was interesting that all of the information that I found was from a deaf press, but none from Black press. And so I'm like, why? You know, why? And so then, is that because of due to racism? Was it due to autism? And so it's so hard to find Black deaf history in a Black press. And so, and vice versa. And so I just think the whole thing is interesting. It's so hard to encapsulate what it means for all of this to intersect. But I don't think, you know, everyone would have an equal answer or response to it. I don't think there's enough Black interpreters that show proper access to health, you know, healthcare. There's not enough Black interpreters that will provide equitable access into anything or to the language. And so there was a doctor, let's say if I go to a doctor and they end up being racist, you know, what then?
Yeah, I mean, if I can share my thoughts on just Black deaf people being taken out of education or just not being included, it's that simple. We just need more inclusion in the education setting. I mean, you told me all of this history today that I've never heard. I couldn't even give you the name of the first Black deaf school. And so that's a huge injustice. And so thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and giving us a wealth of literature today. Jermaine said that she is loving this conversation and your wealth of knowledge, David. And we all hope to meet you someday.
Yes, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Come on. I mean, if you ever have the chance, come over to NVDA conference in two years from now, to 2025.
Yes. Well, I will definitely make an effort to go and also to find a way I can be more in the know about it. Where can we find you if we want to reach out to you, find out more information, check out your blog? Tell us where we can find you.
Well, the easiest is through my website. It's davidaplayer.com. And so right now I haven't really, recently set up the website probably like 2 months ago. So just a heads up, it is a bit fresh, but I haven't really, you know, I haven't written a new article in a while. I've been so tied up with work and just a new life. So do excuse me there, but as you know, as the days go on, if there is something that happens, if there's an uproar or need for an article, I'll do what I can. There is for Black SLPs. I'm curious, on your perspective, why? I mean, so why is it that we find a lot of Black parents are resistant to learning sign language? Because that's been my experience. I'm just curious for you guys. Do you know? Is there any research on that? I know that. I mean, there's not a huge discussion out in the world now, but I do know of one person who has done like a little research. It was done somewhere around like 89, who published an article on most Black deaf experiences and the deaf child experience in a hearing family. And they came to learn through research that a lot of Black parents are resistant to learning sign and push more towards oral communication. I don't know, maybe it's just what their thought or view is on language, or do you think it's more so like a I don't know. I'm just curious. I
Mm.
just want to pick your brain real quick.
I'll let Jermaine answer the research, but from my from my perspective, I think it's definitely sadly about the stigma of just ableism essentially in Black communities, Caribbean communities. They're just not as open. They're just not as open to it.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I think that really ties into autism, right?
Yeah.
Or
Essentially, it's autism. Everyone wants their children to be typical, to be what's socially accepted. And so those parents would lean more into the oral communication. Yeah. Yeah. Jermaine says, I think it also goes back to the discussion about linguicism and autism. Yeah.
yep. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's both of those words, linguism and autism. I'm telling you, and they intertwine.
Yeah, so definitely more awareness on this. Thank you so much for opening up to us on this show. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we go?
I can't think of anything as of now, but hopefully this does spark more of a conversation in the Black community and more navigating between people, and start discussion on issues and all these systems. Because right now it seems like we're all separate from these things that happen, but they happen as a whole. So for some reason we don't see these connections. We don't see where they intertwine. And again, I mean, if you do have, like, to the point, where would you have even known there was a National Black Deaf Advocate Conference?
I agree. I
There's just no
agree.
access.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those things, just like what you mentioned with George Floyd. If it happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. So just building a more united front and culturally aware front for sure.
Right. Yeah. Awesome.
Right.
And thank you guys for listening too. Thank you for tuning in.
Well, thank y'all so much for coming. Everyone who came and tuned in and participated, thank you for coming on the show today. We will see you this Wednesday when we talk to Ebony Green. She'll be telling us about how to get school contracts via your own class. Thank you again, David, and thank you, Dresden, for interpreting today.
No problem, you guys.
Okay, thank you.